covering the outer southeastern suburbs of Melbourne. You're listening to Casey Radio 97.7 FM.
Good afternoon, everybody. You are listening to Casey Radio 97.7 FM, the sound of the southeast. And this is Dr. Linda Wilson coming to you from the Health and Wellness Show. This afternoon I have a wonderful guest to chat to in relation to the concept of mindful leadership. I'm actually really looking forward to this because as a business owner myself, I know that there are times when I could definitely practice a little bit more mindful leadership. So we're going to find out in depth what mindfulness is, what leadership is, and what is the relationship between those two things as we chat to my guest, Michele Gennoe. Michele, are you there?
Hi, Linda. Yes, this is me, Michele, on the line.
Lovely to speak to you, Michele. So, Michele, just so my guests and listeners can get a little bit of information about you, where do you come from? And just tell us a little bit about your background.
Certainly, Linda. My background is that I'm originally from Perth over in the old West Coast, but I've lived here on the East Coast now for over 10 years. My business, which is about leadership development, is actually Australia-wide, but also with our online training programs, we're able to reach a much wider audience globally.
Great, and we are going to be talking a little bit about one of the programs that you're offering to anybody who's listening in this afternoon. So stay tuned, people, because we will be chatting about that in a little while. So, Michele, we're going to be going in depth this afternoon in relation to mindfulness and leadership. So let's just split those two concepts up. First of all, tell me, what is mindfulness?
Well, and I'm glad that we're starting by splitting those two concepts up, because it is important for people to understand what each of those words mean. I do find that when I'm working with people and I'm first introducing them to the whole concept of mindful leadership development, that they don't quite understand how all of those components fit together.
Yes.
So let's start with mindfulness. A very basic understanding of mindfulness is being aware of your thoughts and feelings and your body in each moment. So it's very much an awareness concept, which obviously sounds quite easy, but in practice can be quite difficult to do.
Yes, exactly, because we are often racing around with very busy minds. Our bodies are in motion and or no motion. And, we've got so much going on in terms of focusing on work and life that we forget to actually check in with ourselves. Would you agree with that?
Very much so. It's not just the busyness of life, it's also where in some ways we go into a bit of an automatic pilot.
Yes.
And a great example of that is if you actually say to people, do you remember getting out of bed, having a shower and brushing your teeth? We do those activities so often in our daily lives that we do tend to go into a bit of an automatic pilot.
And I guess another great example of that is when people are driving to work, a place that they've done, driven to, perhaps hundreds of times, and all of a sudden you arrive and you can't actually remember the journey.
Yeah, driving's a great example, as well as walking. We can all remember those great times where we've gone for a walk in the park with a friend and we've been so busy talking that we've got to the other side of the park and then gone, oh, how did we get here?
It's a great way to actually make the walk, go past if you're not an avid walker.
Exactly. It's always about the company you keep.
Exactly. So, Michele, why is mindfulness important for us to understand?
Well, in that point that you made about the business of life and the second point about being on an automatic pilot, if you like, mindfulness is very important because as our bodies and our minds and our emotions come under more and more stress with this 24/7 connectivity we have in today's ever-connected world, we actually need to take care of ourselves at a much greater level than ever before.
Yes.
Those Chinese walls of, I'm now at work or I'm now at home or I'm now with the kids or I'm now here, all of those different walls, if you like, that we used to have between different aspects of our lives have more and more been coming down. So in a sense, we end up more multitasking in every moment with every choice that we make.
And so being connected and staying connected with ourselves helps to combat some of the pressures that exist in our life now?
It helps to combat it, and also, very importantly, helps to recognise it. Mm-hmm. One of the key things when you're running around and you're so busy is that it can be harder to notice, well, actually, I need to take time out. I know I have these 20 things to do, but it's the middle of winter, everybody around me's got a cold, so if I don't take time out, then my body just actually gets worn down. And taking time out actually helps me, my body, to kind of regenerate, and then I'm in a much healthier position to be able to go back in the world and not get all of those cold flus flying around.
I totally agree with you there, and we often say to our staff at my practice, just take that time to wash your hands, let's wipe down the phones, just taking care of our environment in a way as well, not only our internal environment but our external environment, so that we are aware of what's going on around us and can take care of ourselves in that way. So why do you feel there is... I know you mentioned that some of that compartmentalisation that perhaps used to happen in the past is no longer, hasn't carried through to the current working environment. Are there other reasons that you feel it's really, really important for us to, what am I trying to say? I guess I'm trying to say I know that there's a rise in people working from home, taking their home life into their work environment as well. Is it really because of the massive increase in crossover that this is so important that we have an understanding of it?
That's one of the very important components, that dissolving of those Chinese walls, or compartmentalising, if you like. Another very important point to understand is that with the new technologies, people now tend to suffer a disease that they're not terribly aware of, but it's called decision fatigue. Mm-hmm. So the volume of decisions that you're making, purely because of the access to information and the amount of information now available in your face every day through all different mediums, means that you actually now go to the supermarket and instead of having 2 spaghettis to choose from, you might have 20, and you have gluten, and you have this, and you have that. Mm-hmm. So that constant decision-making can create this decision fatigue where people just are basically over having to make yet another decision about all of these different aspects. And that also is one of the things that is why it's very important to become more mindful about, well, these decisions are, small decisions about what type of spaghetti, but this is a bigger decision, and so I need to have more time. I need to actually give myself time to contemplate that more, or to be more rested before making a decision about it.
I love the way you've described that, Michele, because I often talk to my clients about the fact that when we're stressed, and fatigue is a form of stress, we actually have up to 10% less capacity to make really good decisions for ourselves. And you've just described that fatigue as one way we can sort of, I guess, maybe make decisions that we may not necessarily make if we weren't so tired or we weren't so stressed.
Very much so.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about what leadership is then from your perspective.
So from my perspective, the traditional sense of leadership, again, has been very much, and what people have understood in that space is it's about leading a group of people. And depending on whether you're a cooperative leader or a servant leader, all of those different language and terms that they've used, it's been about you with a group of people. I've extended that meaning to be leading yourself as well. So it's not just leading a group of people, it's also leading yourself in your own life. And for me, this is key, and especially as we move more and more into a more collaborative environments within the workforce, where understanding yourself and leading yourself becomes just as critical as leading others.
I can really see that. And in this age of the entrepreneur, us being able to really be, I often describe it as being our own parent, or truly stepping into that adult role of overseeing ourselves in a way, sort of taking that sort of step backwards and getting a perspective on where we're at and how we're at. Very
much so. And you can see also with almost a cult-like status nowadays of people that are actually good leaders, like your Richard Bransons. One of the reasons why they've become like that is because they're such role models, and people are crying out all over the world for these role models of good leadership behaviours. So it's not that they're, a perfect human being. They have their flaws like everybody else, but they're modelling these really good inspirational behaviours that I think when I'm defining leadership, it's not just the old definition of leading a group of people. It's actually including yourself as one of those people that you need to lead. And it then introduces that aspect of, well, what role model do you want to be for yourself to inspire yourself in your own life?
Yeah, very valuable sort of concept for us to take on board, because if we're wanting to take ourselves out into the world in that really open and exposed way, like the Richard Bransons, for example, we kind of need to know who we are.
We do, very much so.
You're listening to Casey Radio, 97.7 FM.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Dr. Linda Wilson, and my guest this afternoon is Michele Gennoe. Michele, I should actually just check. Am I saying your surname correctly?
You're actually doing it very well, Linda.
I did sit down and think, now I really do need to make certain that I get this right. There's nothing worse than hearing your name said incorrectly time and time again on the radio. So big tick for me. Okay.
Well done, you. Yes.
Fantastic. So, Michele, tell me, what is mindful leadership development?
So mindful leadership development then takes those two components I just described about mindfulness and leadership and puts them back into what traditionally businesses and business leaders think of as leadership development. So it uses that traditional structure but introduces mindfulness into that structure. So it's still very much about making money, financial return on investment, keeping the stakeholders happy, leading your teams within your organisations. But it actually looks at it from a very different perspective and builds very much on that core concept I was saying about being a leader in your own life. So its premise is that if you're a better leader in your own life, i.e. you know who you are, what you're doing and why you're doing it, then you're actually a much more inspirational leader to others.
That authenticity.
Yeah, that authenticity, which I'm afraid is a bit of a buzzword at the moment, but it is actually so true. When people, whether they're a leader or not, when you meet somebody and you actually get that sense of how authentic they are or not, it then comes across and you trust them kind of on that subconscious level straight away. So when you're talking about organisations and leaders within organisations, this is critical if you're explaining to your staff and saying, you know, we're going down this path and this is what we need to do and this is why we need to do it. If you don't have that authenticity about what you're saying, and sometimes it can be, you know, we have to fire 10% of the people. It's not always a good message.
Yes.
But it's the way that it's managed and handled.
And I'm just sort of thinking through scenarios that I've been involved in the corporate world as well, and you know the leaders that I still remember and that stuck out for me, they had certainly developed that level of. I had developed a level of trust in them, and it was very much to do with the way that they communicated any message, whether that be good or bad. So that role of really, I guess, earning that trust. What you're suggesting, Michele, if I'm getting this correct, is that when people understand themselves and they use mindfulness as part of their leadership, then they're far more likely to have team members, etc., follow through with what needs to happen. Very much so. And similarly, the breaking down of those Chinese walls I mentioned earlier, this is now breaking down some of those learned behaviours that everybody in a sense has learned when they've gone into a business or a corporate environment, because the survival techniques that you've traditionally needed to keep your head down and not get in trouble are things that actually hold people back from being authentic and being themselves. So mindfulness helps you to break down or break through some of those learned behaviours?
Both of those. It helps you to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, a good example is, well, I'm not going to speak up in this meeting because last time I spoke up, I kind of got shouted down by everybody else in the meeting, which is a learned behaviour. Then you learn not to speak up in those meetings.
Mm-hmm.
But if it, authentically for you, you're sitting there going, well, actually, no, I don't agree with this and it's important to me. So I need to say I don't agree with this. Otherwise, the people in the room don't actually know that it's not sitting right with you, and they don't know that authentically for you it's not correct. But that's that change in those learnt behaviours, because the behaviour that's rewarded, if you like, in many traditional organisations is sitting there and not saying anything and agreeing with everybody.
And I think, you know, we touched briefly on the changing dynamic within business, and you know, this it is a change in behaviour. It's a change in expectation of how people will contribute, and I can see that if there is a breakdown in that, then the level of contribution and the level of perhaps even loyalty to the particular business or company would decrease over time as well.
Yes, and I think the worst example I ever came across was a cultural study in one organisation I worked at, which was talking about learned helplessness, that things had gone so bad in so many ways for so long in the organisation that the staff and the culture was such a one where people had learnt to be helpless and not ask and not speak up. And that's what's so exciting now, Linda, that there is this change and this movement with the technology, with the millennials and the Generation Z coming through. Things are shifting, and it's no longer acceptable to just kind of sit there and go, well, I don't agree with that, but not speak up. Now it's expected that you speak up and you share those reasons why it doesn't sit with you.
So it's very exciting and certainly very dynamic times, and I can understand it would be incredibly challenging for many of the people that you actually work with.
It is. It's changing behaviours, and it's also changing understandings. It can be difficult at times, but I think what's more difficult is not managing or understanding your own change. As we've mentioned, things are changing anyway. So whether you're involved in managing and in kind of like the car example, in the driver's seat of that change, or whether it's just kind of happening to you and you're flowing along, very much comes back to this mindfulness and awareness concept.
And so what I'm sort of getting from what you're describing is that companies are actually engaging yourself, for example, to actually help to move with this new dynamic.
Yes, very much so. So what I traditionally get asked to do is come in, take that mindful leadership framework, which we'll talk through in a little bit, and actually modify and adapt it so it brings in the values of the organisation that I'm working with. So using my framework and structure, but using the language and the values that they want to reinforce with their leadership and with their team that they're developing as the role models for the rest of the organisation.
Right. And so just from my own interest then, do you work with startup companies who haven't even yet established their values and those sorts of things within their establishment?
I can work with startups who are, and I've worked with a number of startups already, and their issues in a way are slightly different in that because they're so caught up in tasks and overwhelmed and, you know, I have 20 things to do and there's only me to do it, they have more of an issue around, and similarly with your area of stress, of managing and prioritising what has to be done, what needs to be done and what's nice to do.
Yes.
And that comes back to understanding your core concept of why you're doing it, what you want to get out of it and how you want to go about doing it.
So they're sort of quite different focuses depending on whether, slightly different focuses depending on whether you're working with a startup, which is very task-oriented, as opposed to a perhaps a more established business which is looking at a redesign of how they actually work with all their people.
Exactly. And the other component around a startup is that although they're managing staff, it tends to be external contractors. So that they bring in experts for components of what they're doing, but there's not an ongoing development relationship with them. So they're not trying to develop and lead them so that they understand all the values and ethos and have the training as leaders in their own business. But they do very much work with them in terms of, even from a task level, role modelling the types of behaviours and interactions that they want for their business.
Absolutely. Relating that back to my practice and the ways that we sort of communicate with our people as well. So fascinating conversation from that perspective as well. So tell me this then, why is mindful leadership important for helping me personally to manage my life?
Why it's so important for you and for each of your listeners to help you manage your life is it's the critical thing now to understand who you are. It's similar to a concept you touched on a little bit earlier about instead of looking outward for the answers, it's about looking inward for the answers.
Yes.
So in a way, we used to go to the doctor and say, "Doctor, I've got this sore foot and, it hurts. Can you tell me why my foot hurts?" Very much in this day and age, you can kind of look at your foot and actually start to work out, well, is it the toe, is it the heel, is it this, is it that? And you can start to also go, well, okay, it feels like the muscle, so I'll put some ice on it. There's a lot more empowerment of being able to do things yourself and every aspect of life, whether it's your foot or your emotions. I had an interaction with that person and now I feel a bit sad or upset because it didn't go too well. So I need to then go and manage that before I have my next meeting or my next interaction with a person. And each of the different levels that we are as human beings, we're needing to manage our own lives and our own components of it so that we in a sense, like with the meeting example, we go from one meeting, we might come out and, that didn't go too well. I just need to regroup, take a few deep breaths, go for a walk around the block, and then go into the next meeting. So that you're not, in a sense, carrying over those emotions and feelings from one meeting to the next. You're managing what's going on for yourself.
Really interesting that, external versus internal, not only validation, but also understanding or involvement in some ways. I often say to my kids, yes, that DVD or CD might make you happy for 10 minutes, but in the meantime, why don't you work out what it is about the CD that actually makes you happy? Do you love the music? Do you love, what is it about it? Rather than that CD being the only focus, let's work out, what it's actually doing for you.
And that's an excellent point, because that externalisation through things, and it's probably heightened even more nowadays through things like reality TV programs, where people in a sense can lose themselves in the lives of other people. It's another way of externalising so that you're not looking at your own thoughts or feelings or emotions about what's going on. And that's why it's even more important to not get caught up in this external world and to actually look more internally at what's going on for yourself.
97.7 FM, Casey Radio.
Welcome back to the Health and Wellness Show, everybody, on Casey Radio 97.7 FM. And I am chatting to my guest this afternoon, Michele Gennoe. Michele, I want you to tell me, how did you come to be in this area of business of mindful leadership development?
Well, Linda, it started a number of years ago where I was first starting to look around for a business opportunity that would combine my two passions. I'd been working in businesses in transformation for over 20 years, and I really enjoyed the challenge of working with organisations while they were going through some really difficult times. You know, you saw the best and the worst of people at those moments.
Yes.
Where people would really step up to make sure that things happened and that they could take care of their staff and take care of their clients. So on both levels, you know, there was a lot of very good behaviours that I observed and also some not as good behaviours. Over the same kind of period, I'd also been doing quite a lot of self-development and personal development work. So I'd worked in overseas in America and in South America and in Europe. And whilst working there, I'd also been very lucky in being able to participate in leadership development programs. One in America ran for 30 days and was pretty much doing presentations every day, which was quite intense, I can tell you. Right the way through to more traditional courses through people like John D. Martini and other leadership training courses. So a few years ago, I was looking at the best way of trying to integrate what had been for me, and I mentioned those Chinese walls earlier, a very much Chinese wall of what I was doing in transformation at work and then what I was doing in transformation in my own personal life. And I was very lucky that the timing worked well and coincided with the growth of this mindful revolution, if you like, globally, where it's become a much more understood and talked about topic, that people now understand some of those concepts that I'd be talking about in the personal development space in the business world.
It's definitely true that these kinds of conversations are no longer on the fringe, so to speak. They're definitely seen as conversations that can be had and should be had within business. So have you found over the time that, you know, there has been greater and greater acceptance of the concepts that you're trying to bring into businesses and organisations? Hello?
Sorry, this is one of the things that happens when you're on the phone. Somebody else was trying to call me.
That is the bonus with mobile phones, isn't it?
It is. I have seen, yes, very much so. I've seen and been very lucky in when I was interviewing people for my book, I was able to talk with senior business leaders across a wide range of organisations. And it inspired me how much things had shifted and things had moved. I'll briefly mention Gordon Cairns, the chairman of Origin Energy. He was a fantastic example of somebody that when he was faced with results of his 360 feedback survey in how people around him saw him as a leader, he had such a bad feedback that it, in a sense, was the catalyst for him to then take action. And that is very, very inspiring. And as we've been talking about, no longer can you kind of go, oh, okay, I'm not seen as a very good leader for this, and this reason, but that's fine because I'm making profit and the shareholders are happy.
Or I'll just move on.
Or I'll move on, If they don't like me, then I'll go somewhere where they do like me and like my style of leadership. And so he is somebody, and he's very well known here in Sydney as a very inspirational leader that when he was faced with those feedback and cold, hard facts, he then took steps. And he very much embraced this mindfulness concept and as over the last few years developed it more and more for the organisations that he was working for. And as I've mentioned before, become like a role model then for what is accepted and not accepted as business behaviour and as a leader. So making those decisions and making those choices about money versus, you know, your style and whether it fits in with the culture and fits in with the behaviours and the role models that we want in the organisation, that shift is just very inspiring and exciting, and I find it wonderful that we now more and more have more of these examples in business that make it okay and make it the new normal in business.
Yes, and I was just about to say, it's very admirable to see someone who obviously has been in business for a long time really, as you said, take that feedback on. Now, Michele, just for the listeners, could you just describe a 360 feedback, what that actual process is?
Certainly. It's a HR tool or human resources tool that organisations can use to give staff, not just senior staff, but all staff, feedback as to how they're perceived and how their performance is going in the organisation.
Mm-hmm.
So you may assess yourself as going, well, I think I'm doing okay, I do a good job, and, people around me think I'm nice and I, get my job done on time.
Yes.
And then what they do is they ask people that are your management, people that are your colleagues, and people that are your clients. And then they collate all of that information and actually give you the real feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, it can work the other way where people actually aren't as aware of how great and how well received they are by their colleagues and their clients.
Mm-hmm.
So it can actually work as this is great behaviours, and it can, stimulate people to continue those on.
Mm.
But it can also reflect, as it did in the example with Gordon Cairns, where the behaviours and the style of management, which may have worked and may have been successful in certain circumstances and situations, wasn't actually what, in a sense, the marketplace, so his clients and colleagues and superiors, what they were expecting from him now in terms of his current behaviours.
And certainly as we see businesses that have intergenerational employees on board as well, that understanding of how your personal management style is received would vary quite dramatically across those generations in many ways.
Very much so. And another concept I talk about in my book when I'm talking about as a leader, one of the important things that gets talked about quite a lot is listening to people and being attentive, etc. Now, some people, that their personality, it's just they're not interested.
Mm-hmm.
And them pretending to be interested just because a 360-degree feedback may say, you need to listen to your staff more, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
That's where that authenticity comes back in again.
Mm.
You may get that feedback saying, we don't feel listened, we don't this, we don't that. But it's being authentic and going, well, actually, I don't want to hear them telling me for 20 hours about whatever it is going on. I actually am not interested. I only want to hear X, Y, or Z.
Yes.
That honesty to people would then shift that 360-degree feedback again. Because while people are pretending to be something that they're not, or something that they think that may be expected of them, I'm a manager, so I should listen, it's not authentic. People actually go for authenticity over everything else all the time.
Very, very interesting. So we do have a lot of businesses who actually listen in, Michele. So that tool, is that something that businesses can design for themselves, or is there an accepted template of the 360 feedback? Because I can certainly see how valuable that is to any sized business.
There are a number of organisations, and I'm sure any Google search will quickly find any.
Fantastic.
They can obviously do it themselves as well. It's not an overly complicated process.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that I'm happy to help with as well if they get stuck, to point them in the right direction as where to find that information.
Fabulous.
But it depends again on the size.
Of course, yes.
We talked about that startup category earlier. If you're a startup, then the best way to do a 360 is using something like MailChimp or SurveyMonkey, using something like SurveyMonkey, which is a free way of doing some quick market research.
Fantastic. And I like that too, because many of the businesses, as we mentioned before, there's a lot of entrepreneurs out there who do have small teams, and so to be able to introduce, something that's not going to either take too much effort or cost a lot of money is always a great tool. So thank you for that. Michele, how can people find you online? So
they can find me online at www.nealthompson, Michele, that's Michele with one L, just like Gennoe, it was a bit complicated. So it's Michele, and then my surname, Gennoe, which is G for golf, ENNOE.com.
Okay, so that's the website. And obviously you have a contact page on the website?
I do. I have a contact page. And I can also give out the email address if you want me to do that at this stage.
Fabulous, because what I'm thinking is that we'll be coming up to the news in another 10 minutes or so, but I'm also thinking that during that break it'd be wonderful if people wanted to hop online and have a look at your website and see all of the various programs that we will also be discussing in the second hour of the show. So it's www.Michele, Michele, Gennoe, GENNOE.com, for anybody who wants to jump online and have a bit of a look. Okay, so I know that you've written a book, Michele, and we're going to come back in just...
Covering the outer southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, you're listening to Casey Radio 97.7 FM.
Welcome back to the Health and Wellness Show, everybody, and my guest this afternoon is Michele Gennoe. And Michele, you're obviously very passionate about mindful leadership development. Has that been something that you've really come to just because of your own personal experience and learnings?
I think every person is a culmination of a sum total of their past, if you like.
Yes.
And so what makes me so passionate about the mindful leadership development space is that within my past, there are a number of times and situations where I didn't feel very empowered about what I was doing or what I was able to do in my life. And this is what makes me so passionate about it now, is this whole understanding and being aware of all of those different areas we've mentioned then empowers me, and it gives me choices. Even if I still end up making not as positive choices, I still understand that I've made that choice. I made the choice to eat the extra Tim Tam that, stays on the hips and, after 2 seconds on the lips. I made the choice to take that job. I made the choice to leave that job. All of those different choices, by understanding and knowing that they're my choices and that I'm empowered about what I do and don't do, I think it really is a very different way of being in life to, in a sense, you're driving your car of your life and you're not just a passenger sitting there and having life direct you.
I absolutely agree with that one. I think that even if we make bad choices, whatever that may mean for people, as long as you feel as though when you made that choice or that decision you were doing so from the greatest vantage point of your own education or your own development, then there's a lot less room there for regret and recrimination and also judgment of yourself. So absolutely 100% agree with what you were saying there. So tell us briefly about your book then, Michele. What's it called, and why did you decide to actually write a book?
Well, the book is called Mindful Leadership, 7 Steps to Transforming Your Business and Your Life. And what I found, and one of the big reasons for writing the book, was that in explaining to people concepts like even what we've gone through, I needed to explain it and show it visually and with a bit more explanation and padding around it so that they could really start to understand and integrate those concepts. I also, in reviewing the literature and with the interviews and different components that I did whilst researching for the book, identified that in that merging of what I was doing between corporate and the business world and the personal development world, I was actually developing my own framework. So the book was the best structure to actually then say to people, this is the framework that I use. So the 7 steps that are outlined in the book are actually then the 7 steps for the leadership development programs that people will be going on.
Wonderful. So people can actually find out about your framework in the book, and then they can experience it when they work with you personally. Definitely.
And the book is then a very extended way of people understanding those concepts. And the book also has exercises so people can begin that journey even without taking any other steps besides the book, of empowering themselves and becoming more aware what they're doing, why they're doing it, who they're doing it with, and what drives them fundamentally, what gets them out of bed in the morning, what gets them to go to work through the cold, dark mornings of winter that we've got at the moment, and what gets them to say, no, I'm not going to do that today because I just don't want to do that. Understanding those decision-making processes and what is driving you is very critical.
Yeah, and again, you know, what you're doing when you are consciously aware is understanding what your choices really are and then taking responsibility for them.
Very, very much so. And that's the fundamental shift, if you like, from how people were operating and what was essentially life in previous years to now, where that internal motivation and that internal focus of what do I really want? Not what, you know, mum and dad said I needed to be when I grew up,
yes,
but what do I really want to do with my life? People that die, when people are around people that die, this magnifies the time that you have in your life quite dramatically for people. And it's a very good way of understanding how your perspective shifts from drifting along day to day, going to work, to, okay, somebody around me has died and I've realised I've only got this limited, precious time in my life. Let's go for it and let's make it the most amazing life I can make it in my life.
Oh, I think that's a fabulous goal and objective for all of us, really, and that leads us back to that whole concept of authenticity all over again, living that authentic life and, you know, being a leader for ourselves authentically so that we're a better leader out there in the community, in our relationships, in our families and in our business life. Very much so, yes. So that we're connected to all of that in a way that's very, very true and authentic for us. Okay, so for people who are listening, you can find Michele on her website, www.michellemicegenoe.com, and we are going to have a little bit of a break for the news now, so feel free just to log in and have a little bit of a scout around.
You're listening to Casey Radio 97.7 FM.
Welcome back, everybody. You are listening to the Health and Wellbeing Show, Health and Wellness Show. I fluctuate between those titles because I haven't really decided, to tell you the truth. This is Dr. Linda Wilson, and my guest this afternoon talking about mindful leadership is Michele Gennoe. And you can find Michele's website at www.michellegenoe.com, and you can certainly find out a lot more about the programs that Michele runs, and we're going to be talking about some of those in the second hour of our program this Tuesday afternoon. Michele, before we went to the break, we were just talking about your book, Mindful Leadership, and you mentioned that you had a fleshing out, I guess, of the scaffolding or the formula or the format that you use within your programs as well. And it sounds to me like many of the authors that we have on the show have had to repeat the same information time and time and time again. And what the book establishes for them is just a way to get that information out there and readily available to people. Is that what you found as well?
Very much so, Linda. One of the easiest ways of explaining to people how you've taken quite a wide-ranging and diverse, and as you can imagine in my topic area, everything from leadership development and traditional structures and strategies around that, right the way through to mindfulness. It's quite a wide and broad area. So having a framework and having a structure really helps within a book format to then be able to say to people, well, here's the way that the program works, here's the areas that we cover, and then they, through reading the book or going online and seeing the structure that's talked about in the book, they can see then, well, okay, if I'm going for this program or this development, this is the steps and the process that we go through, and it really helps to for people to understand what they're getting into.
Yeah, and I think that anybody who becomes more familiar with your philosophy and your way of thinking as they come on as clients, it certainly makes for a very productive relationship.
It does, and it's a way that people can obviously get to know you and your structure and your information in a much more in-depth way than traditionally sort of, if you're taking on, say, a new consultant or a new coach, and you say to them, so what's your approach, what's your methodology? And they might explain it to you and have a nice brochure, but having a book actually gives so much more depth and understanding to the framework, to who you are. And throughout the book, and I'm sure this is the same with your other authors, people use examples from their own lives. Mm-hmm. So you actually get to understand the author a bit more and some of their background and experience in a way that, again, having a brochure or a introductory hour or two conversation, there's just not that depth in those types of communications.
Absolutely. So you use the word purpose in your book, and can you describe to me what you mean by purpose in your book?
What I mean by purpose in my book is meaning.
Mm-hmm.
So I quote Viktor Frankl and his book, which is one of the greatest books of all time, called Man's Search for Meaning. Mm-hmm. And what he identified in his book was basically the driver, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, what our internal drivers are is very different to our external drivers. And the people that understand their internal drivers, it then, as they come more and more to understand that it doesn't matter what the external is, what's happening in the external.
Yes.
So for those that don't know Viktor Frankl, he was one of the people that was in one of the Nazi concentration camps. And his book, Man's Search for Meaning, is actually talking about his experiences and the difference between the survivors of those camps and the people that didn't survive. Mm-hmm. So this is where, for me, when I talk about purpose, I'm actually talking about meaning. So understanding that in your life, you're actually here for a reason, whatever that reason may be, and that reason has meaning, and that meaning is very personal to you.
And I think that having an understanding that your meaning may be very different to the next person's meaning, there's a lot of grace in that, isn't there? There
is. It helps. I've loved shows like Glee and Modern Family that have become more popular in pop culture as well, because what they've done is they've actually made it okay not to be kind of a carbon cookie cutter of what is, the normal, the accepted, etc.
Yes.
And in a similar way, this purpose and meaning, it's very much whatever, gets me out of bed in the morning and makes me excited about life is very different to what is the same motivators for somebody else. Mm-hmm. And that respect that we don't all have to be the same is very different to, again, culturally, what was driving that kind of conformity and homogeneity and all of those things in traditional society that are now shifting and changing.
And it sort of brings us back to what we've touched on earlier in the conversation, which is that, that blossoming of the entrepreneur, where those sorts of, discrete identities or unique concepts and unique personalities are really able to come to the fore for people.
Very much so. So in the entrepreneurial space, people understanding what their meaning is and what drives and motivates them. 5-10 years ago, it may have been looked on like they were a bit crazy for being like that. But now, since Steve Jobs and other role models like that, crazy is celebrated. Crazy is, encouraged. Crazy is, well, if that's what incites and motivates you, then crazy is saying go for it. Go and live the life you want to lead and do what you want to do.
And so you've given me, I guess, a description of purpose and used the descriptor, it's about meaning. What about passion?
Well, The other part about the descriptor with purpose is that very much answers the question of why. Why do we do things and what's the meaning behind it? The next part of passion is very much saying the what. So what is it that I'm going to do in my life and what is it that I'm not going to do in my life? And those two things are very important because that comes back to when we're stressed and when we've got a lot going on, sometimes saying no and working out what you're not going to do in life is just as important as working out what you do want to do in life.
Yes. Finding that that line where you realise, no, okay, this is where I need to draw a line in the sand, or this is where I suddenly realise I have to make a different choice or go in a different direction.
Very much so. And in this area, the example that I like to use is very much when you're on an airplane and the stewardess says to put on your mask before you then help children with their mask. The reason for that is that if the plane depressurises and you go to help the child first, you could lose consciousness and then you can't help the child.
Yes.
So in many ways, again, it's kind of counterintuitive to what people think that they should be doing. They should be helping the children. But it's reinforcing that idea that the more you help yourself, the more you can actually then help the children around you and the people around you. So that what and that question around passion, so what is it that I'm going to do in my life, is that same kind of idea. Taking care of yourself so that you can then help take care of others.
And so what about pathways to decision making? Can you describe to me what you mean by that? Is that about experience and suddenly coming across a path that might take you closer to an expression of your passion or your purpose?
Well, the pathways, which is the third step in the framework within the book, is very much around the steps that you take to decision making. And again, is a fascinating aspect of human behaviour. We were talking earlier about, driving or walking and then suddenly being aware that you'd arrived and not quite knowing how you got there. In a similar way, many times people aren't quite aware of how they're going about making decisions. So the pathways component of the 7-step framework is about the decision-making component. Are you using your intuition to make decisions, or are you using a structured and more logical method around making those decisions in life? And the two ways are just as important to each other, so it's not like you should only do one way or should only do another way. It's actually finding that balance. And the best way of explaining it that I've found with people, that, especially people that love Star Trek like I do, if you think of it as being, Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock. Captain Kirk, especially in the early days, seemed to go to different planets and beat everybody up and was very emotional and emotive and pretty much emotional and intuitive driven. And so you had the opposite character in Mr. Spock there, and Mr. Spock was very much logic and there were no emotions. And the interplay between the two of them is actually what made each of them bigger than themselves.
Yes.
So in a similar way, decision-making in the pathways is about understanding within yourself, when are you actually making decisions using your structured and more logical framework, and when are you actually using more of an intuitive framework, and then being able to be Captain Kirk or Mr. Spock with each of those components when you're making decisions.
And so would you encourage people to perhaps develop the style that they don't use as much as the other then, as a way of balancing out their decision-making process?
Very much so. So if you tend to be more intuitive and just make decisions without really gathering all the facts, then obviously you would want to gather a few more facts. And then if you're on the other side, paralysis by analysis, you actually want to use a little bit more of your intuitive side and actually make decisions based on what seems right. So there is no right or wrong, but it's actually developing those both sides of yourself. And the other part about intuition, as an example that I use for people so that they can get it in a bit more of a tangible way, is if you're walking along the street and you're going to cross the road and you stop, and you don't know why you've stopped, but you just stop from crossing the road at that point in time, and the car goes by. And there was nothing logical or sensible or any information that would have said, don't walk across the road at this point in time. But there was something in you that knew to stop at that point in time.
Yes.
So that intuitive voice is very important in this very busy world with all of this information and noise around, to be able to learn to tune into, to know whether it's a decision in business or a relationship in the world, when do you need to stop and actually just trust that intuition before stepping out in front of a car.
Love it. And all of this comes from us really continuing to be mindful of ourselves and having an awareness of ourselves.
97.7 FM, Casey Radio.
Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to Dr. Linda Wilson and my guest this afternoon, Michele Gennoe, on the Health and Wellness Show. Oh, it's just been a really interesting chat for me this afternoon. I hope it has been for you as well. Just wanting to remind you that you can look at more of Michele's stuff on her website, michelegennoe.com. So do feel free to pop in there. And in the next little while, we're actually going to be talking about some of the special offers that Michele is making to listeners this afternoon. So do hang around. Michele, what do you mean when you're talking about people in your book? What does people mean?
So as a part of the 7-step framework, what I mean about people and the definition that I'm using in the book is very much about that vision component of when you're a leader. So as a leader and you're wanting to inspire people and share with them your vision, it's very much looking at how do you explain that vision so that people understand, firstly, what your vision is. And then secondly, how do you form teams and ask people to collaborate in succeeding in creating that vision? Especially in the startup phase, when people are, in a sense, explaining what their business is to everybody quite a number of times. It's even more important at that stage because what you're doing is you're starting to program in, not just to others, but to yourself, what your vision for your business is.
Okay. I can see we're developing a little bit of a theme. We've got purpose, passion, pathways, people, and I know we're also going to talk about prosperity and possibly personal branding as well as we move through. Was it intentional for you to be using all of these wonderful words starting with the same letter?
Well, one of the aspects of my background was I studied marketing many years ago. And in marketing you have the 4 Ps. And so in developing this model and this framework, I actually came up with the 7 Ps of leadership.
Clever.
And so, yes, that's why there's this P theme as you go through it.
Yeah, fantastic. So prosperity is our next P word. So it is important. It's an important part of your framework. Can you explain what you mean when you talk about prosperity?
What I mean when I'm talking about prosperity is that giving and receiving cycle. So a lot of people understand about giving and especially organisations and Australians are very well known for being very generous and very giving as a population. But it's also important to understand how it fits into the whole cycle of prosperity and abundance. So as well as giving, we need to be able to learn how to receive. And that can be everything from a compliment all the way through to receiving more money. And as a business owner, that can be quite critical because sometimes it can be a poverty consciousness. And sometimes it can be a lack consciousness. You know, I can't share this with somebody or I can't do this because if I do that, then by giving that, then, you know, I'm giving away too much. So it's very much opening up to what, you know, the Rockefellers and all of these very wealthy people have worked out and again, are great models for. That philanthropy was because people, they may have just been nice people, but they also worked out that to keep that flow, and it's also an energetic flow as well as being a physical flow of money, they needed to get into this cycle of giving and receiving and understand how it was working within their own lives and their own businesses.
And I think, if we bring that right back to the very personal, knowing how to give and receive compliments within ourselves, knowing how to give and receive constructive perhaps feedback for ourselves is also really integral to that's part of it.
Oh, very much so. And the receiving part there is also quite interesting and critical. People can be their own worst critic, if you like.
Yeah.
So actually learning to be your own best supporter. So you're your own cheer squad going, yes, I did it. You know, I may have 20 things on the list of to-do today, but I got 5 of the most important things done. So instead of focusing on the 15 that weren't done, celebrating the 5 that did get done and receiving the, job well done, great work today. No, we didn't get through all the list, but, we're going to keep going. And because we did so much great stuff around those 5, it's going to keep building me and building the business.
Oh, I just think that's such important information for people to hear, because if we don't actually celebrate what we have achieved, where are we refueling for ourselves? How are we going to maintain our commitment and our passion, particularly when things start to get pretty tough, as inevitably things can do. So I really feel like celebration, we've discussed that a lot on the show as well, is something that we need to give ourselves permission to actually do.
And you also need to ritualise it. So permissioning is the first part of it, but then ritualising it so you actually notice it and you make a point of noticing it. So just like people make a point of, okay, I need to pay these bills and I need to do this and I need to do that. One of the great examples I know of is actually having some butcher's paper on the wall, and every time you actually have a success, adding to that butcher's paper on the wall. So you've got this visual reminder of everything you've been successful about.
Wonderful. What a great idea. That's taking the vision board to it's sort of like a different slant on the vision board, isn't it?
It is, and it's reinforcing, success breeds success is very true. So it's reinforcing, if I was successful in doing these things I set out to do, you start to break down and forget the other 15 things that were on that list and go, oh, okay, I was successful in this, so I can do it, I can keep going, I can make that next target.
Absolutely. And, I've talked a lot with my clients and also on the show about the development of neural pathways, and the way that they are developed is by practicing their usage. And if we ritualise, as you're suggesting, celebration and acknowledgement, and create things in our day or things in our week or things within our relationship, whether they be business or personal, that actually cements those in, we're actually building and reinforcing neural pathways, which is a wonderful thing to have going on in your life.
Very, very much so. It's all about building the positive programming, yeah.
So you've interviewed some really incredible leading business figures, and you've mentioned one who was inspiring for you personally, which was Gordon Cairns. Who else have you actually interviewed, and are they a part of your book, Michele?
So I was very honoured and lucky to be able to interview a number of leading and Australian business celebrities or personalities. Gordon Cairns was probably the standout for me in terms of the journey from before to after. But other people I had the honour and privilege of interviewing included people like Neal Thompson, who's the CEO of Virgin Velocity. And Neal, again, was such an inspirational person in that through his own life journey, through business and through his life experiences, he'd actually weaved and integrated so much of his personal philosophy into how he is as a CEO and a leader in his business. In a similar way, some of the amazing female leaders I interviewed ranged from people like Ruth Med, who runs Women on Boards and is very dedicated and committed to increasing the number of women on boards in Australia, which at the moment is still quite an appallingly low number.
Yes, and it's been very topical in the last few months, hasn't it, or last year or so?
It's been very topical, and having interviewed her and understood some more of the fundamentals as to how that poor situation has come about and how her and her team are working to change it, it's just, again, amazing and inspirational that they're so in tune with what's going on. And in a similar way, Lisa Chung from, again, a completely different market. She's a senior partner with Maddox Lawyers. Mm-hmm. And Lisa, has done a lot, whether as chair of the Benevolent Society or within Maddox itself or as a private individual, to not only give back to the community and to the people that she works with, but to develop these relationships and be very much that role model of, these are the mindful ways to do things and this is how you go about doing it. And in many ways, Lisa was a good example, again, where as a leader she was just kind of doing these behaviours but may not necessarily have even called them mindful. But they're now being called that because they are the role models of the future and where we're moving towards as a society.
Really wonderful. And so do you tell the stories or give the information within the book that you've written, Mindful Leadership?
So the way that I've condensed what was quite long interviews is actually excerpts from the interviews within the book, and I also relate it back to the theme. So with each of the different people, so there were 7 interviews for the books to support each of the 7 different points. And what I've done in the book is actually take out the core concepts and the core ideas from those interviews with those amazing people and place them into the book so people can get a sense of, okay, for example, I'm talking about working with people and dealing with people, and then somebody like Ruth Med talks about, her giving back and her helping women to reach that, director role and some of the ways that she goes about helping that, and she is that role model again. And you'll hear me talk about role models quite a lot because that's the focus of the the end point, if you like, of the mindful leadership development training is to develop those role model skills so that you can then inspire and lead others.
Absolutely, I love it.
Covering the outer southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, you're listening to Casey Radio 97.7 FM.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Health and Wellness Show with myself, Dr. Linda Wilson, and my wonderful guest, Michele Gennoe. Michele, we have covered off on a lot of fabulous information. Thank you this afternoon. I know I've really enjoyed myself, and I hope the listeners have too. I want to talk to you a little bit now about meditation. Now, a lot of people are aware of meditation. It's certainly become something that, again, is part of the general conversation. It's a very obvious way of pausing in life, but what are some of the other areas that you highlight in your framework in terms of giving people tools to pause in their life?
Well, Linda, the way that I talk about pausing as the next P in the framework and include the area of meditation in that is I talk about mindful movement and mindful stillness. And to me, that seems to be I've not seen it grouped anywhere else like that, but that seems to be the most logical way of understanding it. So mindful movement can be things from paying attention while you're eating. So we all remember as kids being told to, pay attention while we're eating so the food didn't roll off the plate, all the way through to mindful walking and being aware of, your environment and the noise. And it can be quite reflective and meditative to actually go for a walk along the beach and just to be really present. So in that way, I describe mindful movement. Mindful stillness, I talk a little bit more about the different types of meditation. And the stillness comes from sitting down, traditionally in a chair, so that you're actually slowing down your heartbeat, slowing down your breathing, and actually just in that stillness coming into your own internal silence.
Mm-hmm.
And meditation, whatever form, whether it's an active form of meditation, a passive or a chanting kind of meditation, there's so many different types and so many different traditions that, again, it's a matter of trying out a few of them and then working out which one works best for you.
I don't know whether you've read the latest Norman Deutsch book, but The Brain That Heals Itself, but he gives a really fabulous example of mindful movement with a person who actually had developed Parkinson's disease. And using mindful movement, that person had actually learnt to retrain themselves to be able to move without some of the very typical symptoms, I guess, that develop with Parkinson's disease. So I can absolutely relate to that concept of mindful movement. In regards to mindful stillness, a lot of people don't like spending time with themselves.
No, and this is the probably the health issue of our age, of people getting disconnected now from the devices. So it can be, just like for coffee lovers, it can be difficult to give up coffee for a few hours. It can be difficult now for people to give up being on their devices for a short period of time. And in that way, that's why it's even more critical to, remember that when you went for that walk down the beach, you might have then sat there and stared out at the ocean for a little while. You didn't actually walk down the beach, sit there and then go on your device, because you would have missed out on that stillness, that moment. And so that's why it's probably even more critical than it's ever been to disconnect from all of the things that we can get caught up in.
I think it's certainly a lesson for adults, but most definitely for children as well, as I guess a lot of those devices are used as babysitting tools. And I know I have that struggle with my son at the moment of just sort of saying, okay, that's enough time on that now, let's walk around the lake, or let's just take a little bit of time, have some lunch, do something a little bit different, breaking into that cycle of almost dependence on some of the technology that we use.
It is, and isn't it so incredible how I can't even think of the strong enough word to use, but creativity comes from that stillness. And by not pausing and giving yourself that mindful space of stillness, you're actually stimulating your brain and you're stimulating all of your senses all of the time. Whereas when you take away all of those devices and attention on outward things, you're actually then stimulating the creative centres internally and allowing all of that to blossom, and especially with children, allowing them to develop that creativity where the device isn't, in a sense, entertaining them. They need to find ways to entertain themselves.
Yes.
And that space, that stillness, gives them the space to do that.
And again, looking at the brain and the way that the brain operates, that 10% of resources that I talked about when you're stressed and you lose that ability to make the best decisions that you possibly can, when we are still, we're actually having access to those resources, and that is our dreaming centre, our creativity centre, the area that helps us in relationship and connection with not only ourselves but others as well. So we're allowing ourselves to use that portion of our brain, as you mentioned.
And it's so critical to, as a child, to learn how to access that and then recognise when I, like I was talking about the decision-making earlier, when I need to make these types of decisions, I need a creative answer as opposed to 1 + 1 = 2, which is a straightforward answer.
Yeah, and I think as life is more and more complex, creativity and innovation is what is going to make, the difference in our world, certainly in terms of us taking care of our environment, etc. Innovation and creativity are going to be key. And
I guess then the key for entrepreneurial listeners is to understand that when they're looking to develop and grow, what gives them that unique edge is that creativity and their ability to do things in a different way and in a quicker way than what other thinking is, which the biggest tool they can then use for that is some of this mindful stillness.
Okay. So how do you pull all of these areas together in the services that you offer?
So the way that I pull it together is that I offer people either consulting, coaching, and that's corporate and individual coaching, or facilitation, where I run workshops and trainings so that under that umbrella of leadership development, I'm working depending on what the requirements are, using each of those delivery mechanisms.
Right. So you're looking at each individual business and you're, I guess, flexing within the framework to find out what it is that they need more of or less of, etc.
Exactly. And in a similar way to how things have shifted in the business world, instead of describing myself like in a traditional sense as a consultant or a coach or a trainer, what I have just described is that I can support people and support businesses with moving along that leadership development journey, and these are the different tools or methods I can use to help them.
Very, very interesting. So I just want to give out your website again, Michele. It's www.michele with one L, Gennoe, GENNOE.com. And we are slowly running out of time, Michele. So I just wanted you to talk about the offers that you actually have for the listeners today. Could you take us through a few of the things that you're actually offering to anyone who happens to be listening in today?
So thanks, Linda. The first thing that I'd like to offer the listeners is a signed copy of the Mindful Leadership book. So the first 3 people that register online, perhaps through that contact page that they can get to through the website, I'm very happy and pleased to offer them 3 signed copies of my book. The second thing that I'd like to offer to the listeners is access to a soon-to-be-released Mindful Leadership online training.
Wonderful.
So I'm so excited about it. We're at the final stages of development, and so I'm willing and happy to offer some listeners 3 places in that online training. So again, the first 3 people to come through will get the copy of the book, and then the next 3 will get through onto the leadership training. And then the third thing that I thought would help to engage the listeners and also help to pull together some of what we've talked about is a mini competition around how mindful leadership can help me be a better leader. And so the prize for that would be a complimentary 30-minute leadership assessment. And again, as I explained, using either consulting, coaching or training, depending on what their requirements are. So they would win 30 minutes as a leadership assessment in that.
Wow, that's very, very generous. Thank you. So I'm just going to repeat that, and people need to be quick on this.
I can imagine it will go very quickly.
I'm signalling madly to the people in the radio station so they can... No, I'm not. I'm just joking. Firstly is the 3 signed copies of your Mindful Leadership book, which is called Mindful Leadership. Secondly, 3 free places in the Mindful Leadership online training trial, soon to be released. When do you think that's going to be out, Michele?
It'll actually be released fully to the public by mid-August. It's in its final stages of development. Very
exciting. I know what it takes to create something like that, so congratulations in advance for actually achieving that. And then thirdly, very generously, a complimentary 30-minute leadership assessment. And in that you will find out how mindful leadership can help you to become a better leader. Now, the place that you go to is an admin email, so it's admin at Michele Gennoe. I'm going to spell that again, MicheleGennoe MichelleGennoe.com, admin@MichelleGennoe.com. I would get on there fast, people, so that you are in with a bit of a chance to win one of those fabulous prizes. Michelle, I wanted to say a really big thank you this afternoon for your time. I appreciate that you've spent a solid 2 hours with us, and I know that taking time out of your own business to help people to learn new things, not only about themselves, but perhaps also learning some skills that they can apply in their business is a very generous thing for you to do. So thank you so much for that.
Well, and thank you, Linda, and I hope that the things and the topics that we've covered today have been very helpful to the listeners.
Mm-hmm.
And my wish for them is that they take some of that information and implement it into their lives more fully, and develop their lives as more mindful leaders, and become those role models to the people around them, to their children, to their community, and to their businesses.
Absolutely wonderful. Now, Michelle, I also know that you do a lot of your training in Sydney, and did I see that there is actually a 3-day training coming up for people in Sydney? Is that something people can also find out about, or is that something that's only open to existing clients?
I'm actually doing a half-day training, funnily enough, on stress management.
There you go.
There's been quite a demand. I did some research as to what next topic would best suit my clients, and stress management came out as number one.
Mm-hmm.
So building on some of those pausing components that we were talking about earlier, I'm running a stress management workshop in Sydney on the 23rd of July.
Yes.
You can again register for that through my website.
Great. And so that's a live workshop with you presenting?
That's a live workshop here in Sydney.
Fantastic.
So people get to actually experience everything we've covered in this last 2 hours and much more in a face-to-face setting, obviously.
Wonderful. So that's on the 23rd of July, and you can also find out about that on the website, MichelleGennoe.com. Michelle, thank you so much, and lovely chatting with you.
Thank you very much, Linda, and thank you very much to your listeners.
Bye.
You're listening to Casey Radio 97.7 FM.